want to use this video to explain a little further the idea of trinities and how that can be used to interpret or work with a piece of literature. And certainly we have numerous ways of approaching Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's great work, by and through the use of trinities. So let's take a look at a document that I've prepared. And you can see this is one of the tasks, maybe the final task that you'll be working on, where I'm going to give you 9 examples of different types of trinities, each of which could be used to help understand and explain different elements or pieces of the story Frankenstein. So we're going to start with 2 very familiar ones and then maybe move into some that are maybe a little less familiar. So this video is about trying to explain those briefly, but I encourage you to look a little deeper into these trinities. I mean, you can do your own research, even if it's just looking at something like a Wikipedia page to help you clarify what the different parts are. So think about that as we kind of move forward. So let's start with the first 2. Okay, the idea of the id and the ego. So these are Freudian is what we call. So if we're going to apply like the ideas of a Freudian analysis, we'll think and we'll be on the lookout for 3s. Now, the reason why I mention this is in literature, it's very common to have different pieces broken up into 2s. Okay, so sometimes we see what's called a dichotomy. Okay. Or even on some levels it might be a paradox, okay? And these are 2 elements. They can be characters, they can be events, they can be anything within, the elements of fiction, but they tend to polarize one another. And so what you get is a pair of opposites, okay? And they serve really well as comparison points and contrast points. When we introduce the idea of a 3rd figure, what we tend to get is a mediator between the opposites. So something that is neither one side or the other. And I think as we go through this will become a little bit clearer. But 3s within literature are very important. Think of it as like 3 points of an equilateral triangle. If done effectively, each of those segments is going to be of equal length, right? And so one is not greater than the other. The angles that connect them are going to be of equal value as well. And so 3, highly important number. So let's start with Freud. And Freud divided the subconscious into 3 elements: the id, the ego, and the superego. And I want you to think of the id as being like your appetite, okay? It is that part of you that is uncontrolled. It sees something, it wants it. It's you driving your car at 2 in the morning and you're coming to a stop sign in the middle of nowhere and your id says, run it, man, just don't even bother, put the pedal to the metal. The appetite, the id part, is going to be mediated by something called the superego. And if you want, this is kind of like the adult. Some people look at it as like the moral part of you or the parent part of you. But the superego is a set of rules. And it tells you no or it tells you yes. In between the 2, the mediator is the ego. So it would look at it and it would say, you're coming to the stop sign. The id says, run it. It's 2 a.m. There's nobody around. Enjoy the thrill. The superego says, no, stop, look both ways, wait 3 seconds, and then proceed forward as you normally would with any stop sign. The ego says, okay, we're going to do a California roll on this. I want you to slow down, pay attention. We're not going to hit it at top speed, but we're not going to completely stop. It's 2 in the morning. So you have the child part and the adult part mediated by the ego. And that's Freud. So think about that in terms of maybe looking at 3 different characters like Captain Walton, Victor, and the creature. Or maybe even looking at within Victor's family. Is there, if Victor is all appetite, is there a character that would serve as like his moral compass, like a Henry Clerval or Elizabeth, or even a mother or father? And then finally, who is that figure that kind of keeps him between those 2? Okay. Now, a second term that we can look at, or second grouping, would be the theological, and this is much more religious in scope. So this is the notion that we can begin to look at characters as a father idea, a Son, and a Holy Spirit. So if you want to think of that as almost a play off of Freud, you have the authority, okay, you have the rebellion, okay, and you have also you have the confessor, okay, at some level, all right. So the spirit that gives voice and consciousness, that evaluates. The Son, and rebellion, I don't mean in a negative sense, but it takes some of the qualities of that authority and it makes it changes it. It makes it more gentle. Okay. So again, you can explore this in religious terms, or you can look at it more in terms of how it might relate to the Freudian. Some other aspects we have, the Aristotelian. You certainly should have studied the ideas of ethos, logos, and pathos, where we have the ethic. Okay, we have the logical, okay, or if you want, the word itself, okay, and then certainly we have the emotional. And these three forces work sometimes in harmony, but sometimes against one another. In Aristotle's model, what you would get would be this perfect interchange between the ethical, the logical, and the emotional, and they would stay in balance. When one is tilted one way or the other, suddenly we maybe get out of harmony. So you could approach it maybe looking at it like that. All right, some other models we have. The sociological. Sociological says we can look at a situation like what's happening in a novel on an individual level, as the only people that are affected are the specific individuals and no one else. We can look at it a little bit larger and think of it in terms of the family. So you could look at the isolation of the Frankenstein family and how they are very different than other families. We have Victor, perhaps. We have the Frankenstein family. And then we have the community, which would be made up of the people in the towns and villages where they inhabit. Now, the Platonic look at this is very similar. Some would say that Freud ripped off Plato, but the Platonic Trinity involves the use of the logical, okay, which we identified as logos, okay, which you could also identify maybe as the superego, okay, or if you wanted to, you could identify in the theological term as the Holy Spirit, okay. You have the spiritual aspect, and then you have the appetitive aspect, which for Freud would be the id, okay. The spiritual could be superego, could be ego as well. But those three interact with each other. And so Plato maybe envisioned these as being, this drives behavior, okay. These two are controls of behavior, okay. So this is the drive, this is the motivation, and these are the two mechanisms that keep it in check. And the idea behind any of these trinities is the idea of harmony, okay. So it's the idea that how do we keep a system in balance, okay. And so a system could be something like Victor. Victor exists as a system. The creature does too. Their relationship, their movement with one another is another system. How would we describe the harmony and whether or not it's being smooth, okay, or whether or not it's being upset in some way, shape, or form? All right. And then looking at some of these other models, we certainly have the Luciferian, I'll call it. And so when we go to Paradise Lost, we explore this a little more. But it's the notion that we have three figures that are affecting mankind. That first figure is going to be Satan, but Satan has two offsprings. His children are sin and death. And these three operate together. And you see the interrelationship. Satan may serve as a tempter, okay? And certainly sin becomes, if you look at, some of these other models, sin becomes the action that's taken and death becomes the consequence, okay? Temptation, choice, consequence. Other models we look at, we have certainly have the developmental, okay, where you could look at a character like the creature in terms of its development into adulthood, its movement from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, each of those very different stages, each of those demanding kind of a different description of responsibility, a different description of morality, a different description of understanding and sympathy. So you could take a character like Victor, you could take a character like Creature, and try to explain where they seem to be at different points in the story. Do they ever grow to adulthood, or are they sticking in adolescence or childhood? And then certainly we talked about this with the idea of sin. We have Augustine's model of temptation, debate, and then action or decision. And so you could frame a nice discussion about how those interact with each other. And then finally, you could look at the familial, the family roles that people play, the idea of a father figure, a mother figure, and a child, and how they interact. What are the different roles that each plays, and in what way do they malfunction sometimes? So again, what we're getting to is this idea that we have this system of triangles, and in a story that's running on all cylinders where everything is perfect, we have a harmonious interconnection among these three elements. Where there is dysfunction is when one of the elements begins to dominate the others, or we see an absence of one, and the lack of that creates a void which needs to be filled by the other two. And so you have a character who winds up in imbalance, or a situation that winds up in imbalance or seems to be unnatural in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so again, the idea which you guys are going to be working on is taking a look at all three of these. Okay, I'll move that so you can see it a little better. I'm sorry. You're going to choose 4 from this list, and then you're going to do set up what's called a Venn diagram. So our Venn diagram looks like this, okay? And you're going to set up that Venn diagram and fill it with information, basically taking me through your understanding of how the Trinity is taking place. Now, you may do this on a large sheet. You may do it in some kind of key where you've got something written out here. If you're having trouble doing circles on a Word document, you might try first putting them on a Google slide and then copying the picture, doing a screenshot of just that picture, and then you can transfer that image onto a document if it works better. Or again, this is something you could do by freehand. Okay. All right. Good luck. If you have questions, please let me know.